we're going to continue with the history lessons for today. Our topic today is social and economic developments during the colonial period in Kenya. Previously, in the previous topics, we've been talking about how colonial administrators partitioned Africa and how they administered various countries in Africa. So we've talked about how they used company rules and how they used to use every method available so that they can effectively manage their colonies. So today we want to be specific about Kenya, and the whole of this unit is a part of history that touches on Kenya, meaning or implying that this is a part of paper 1 history. So for the candidates and other students from 3 upwards, you should know that this is a part of paper 1 because it deals with the history of Kenya. Now, in the previous chapters that we studied in Form 3 work, we were talking about how the colonial powers used to administer their colonies in Africa. So in this unit, we'll be very, very specific to the social, economic, and political developments that were carried out in Kenya during the colonial period. And to commence this, in the year 1895, a very important thing happened in our country because the British declared Kenya to become a part of their protectorate. Now, after 1895, the British declared this territory to become what is called the British East African Protectorate. Now, afterwards, it was their wish that they wanted to do everything possible within their domain to ensure that this place or this territory was going to be made viable economically and politically and everything. So they wanted to make it a territory that is economically viable. So what they had to do was that they had to exploit Kenya. Now, when they were doing so, they ensured that as they were exploiting Kenya, they realized that some areas of Kenya were very, very cool and fertile, implying that these very, very areas were a replica of the climate that they have in Europe. Now, Europe is the only continent in the world without a desert, meaning when these colonialists, or colonial powers, they had exploited Kenya, when they went to the White Highlands or the areas that they found that were very, very cool and wet, then they already knew that these places could be exploited so that they could make a lot of profit, both in dairy farming and cash crop farming. Now, that was the first thing. Now, again, they also realized that this territory of Kenya did not have a lot of mineral deposits. So the implication was that they were going to make it viable, and this is what they were going to do. They were going to farm in these highlands or these places that they considered to be economically or agriculturally productive. Now, this is what they did. They encouraged the settlers to come in and settle to do farming. Now, in our slides, as we're going to check later, we're going to realize that there were some reasons that made them to use the settlers instead of African. Now, who were the settlers? These were the people that they came from Britain and other domains that Britain had colonized. Again, they also realized that there was one thing. There was a problem of transport, poor transport and communication. So to make this area to be economically viable, they had to develop the infrastructure that deals with the transport. Now, anybody will tell you that the most important infrastructure that deals with the transport in this part of Africa is roads, and then another one is rail. Now, this will guide us to the subtopic today, the Uganda Railway. I'll also mention to you why it's called the Uganda and not Kenya Railway, and that will be a subtopic. Again, to ensure that this place was again more economically viable, they wanted to tackle this biggest problem of transport. So they wanted to expand communication through the building of the railroad, and number 2, water, and then air transport. Then the last one was postal and telecommunication services. I've not mentioned phones because phones came much later when the mobile phones, not phones, telephones. The phone services is much proactive in the very, very years after independence. That is the era that we live in today. Now, these infrastructural facilities, they were aimed at enhancing effective administration of the region. Now, there was the Uganda Railway. Now, Uganda Railway was meant to connect Uganda as a territory, not the British East African Protectorate, that was Kenya. So it was meant to connect Uganda to the sea and then to the outside world. Why? Because Uganda was vast in mineral deposit, and it was vast with all the things that made it to be a place that could be economically exploited, not like Kenya that lacked mineral reserves, a lot of mineral reserves by then. Now, to do so, the British saw it best to ensure that Uganda is connected to the port, so that the raw materials like copper that come from places like Kilembe mines could be shipped direct to the Indian Ocean and to the industries of the British. Then again, they wanted to connect Uganda to the outside world, that I've said. Again, at the time of construction, the British used to have a lot of economic interest in Uganda, more than the British East African Territory. So to do this, they just considered our territory, which was Kenya, to be a British protectorate, and that since it was the land that stood in between the interest of the British in Uganda, all this infrastructural development had to pass through Kenya. That is why the railway is called Ugandan Railway and not the Kenyan Railway. The need to build this railway started with the views of businessmen. So people like Sir William Mackinnon, they did survey works that enabled the railway to be built. But then they realized that there was one thing that was very, very key that was lacking. Why? The British lacked the funds to finish the track. So initially I told you that the British, they accorded the Imperial British East African Company, IBEAC, the mandate to rule or to administer the colony, the British East African Protectorate, on the behalf of the British government. So this company, it had insufficient funds. So what made this to be possible? When the establishment of the protectorate was made by the British in Kenya, then it meant that the British government is the one that provided for the funds that were needed for the construction of this railway track. Now, I want you to go to my slides, and we will see with you, I'll explain with you all the reasons for the effective control for the building of this Ugandan railway. So the first reason, according to the slide, was to establish effective control over the British East Africa. So the administrators, the DEOs, the provincial commissioners, all of them, the district officers, they were going to be transported through the railway. So this was going to make an effective control over the British East Africa. Again, for the regions where the British were going to face resistance, then it was going to be very easy for them to transport reinforcement of police officers or soldiers from the coast to the interior of East Africa. Then to facilitate maximum economic exploitation of the region. Mostly the railway ran from the areas of various economic interest direct to the port of East Africa that was situated in Mombasa. So for instance, if the White Islands was known for producing tea, then you'll find that according to the Ugandan railway that was built, then it stretched to places like Nanyuki, such that areas that were rich in coffee production, like the former central province, these areas, they had to have a railway line to ensure that farmers could transport their raw materials like raw coffee beans and tea to the port. Then in Western Kenya, which is rich in sugarcane, you'll find that the railway track had to follow this economic path. Then the railway track went until Kilembe mines and very, very important places. Again, in Kenya today, you'll find that a town like Magadi, which has soda ash, still also it has the railway tracks goes up to there. So it was to facilitate maximum economic exploitation of the region. Then the next thing was that the British wanted to stop slave trade and promote legitimate trade. Now among the recommendations that were given at the Berlin Conference, when the colonialists were partitioning our country and the rest of Africa in the Berlin Conference, was that each colonial master was to stop slave trade. and that was a trend that was there by then. Then it meant that the communities that had during the pre-colonial time embraced slave trade, they were going to turn to legitimate trade like farming and other things instead of slave trade. Then again, the British wanted to facilitate the movement of troops and government administrators into the interior. This one, I explained it under the first point. Then the British wanted to link Uganda with the coast and outside world, to the coast and outside world. This is it. I've said and mentioned that the British had more economic interest in Uganda more than they had in Kenya. Why? Because a lot of resources were found in the Ugandan territory more than the British East African Protectorate, quote unquote, Kenya. Now, this is it. The region that was Uganda by then started from Naivasha going on up to Ugandan territory. By then, the boundaries had not been accomplished. We're going to learn that one consequences of building the railway, it meant that other parts of the region, the Uganda, were accorded to Kenya. So it also changed the dynamic of our borders. That one we'll explain later. Then again, to transport raw materials from the interior to the East African coast. Now, all the raw materials that were found within the British East African Protectorate, raw materials like sisal, raw materials like tea, coffee, pyrethrum, wheat, dairy products, and then the minerals that were found within this protectorate, they were all transported to the coast via the railway line. Then to make it possible for the British to protect their strategic interest in the region. Among the strategic interests of the British that made them to colonize the British East African part, which is Kenya, is that one was to protect the source of River Nile. Now, to do so was that this railway line was linked from Mombasa via Nairobi to Port Florence, which is nowadays referred to as Kisumu. So this was meant that by the railway line reaching points of Lake Victoria meant that they were going to protect the source of River Nile. That was one of the strategic reasons why the British not only colonized Kenya and Uganda, but all of the vast domain in east and the northern parts of Africa. Then to make it, by making it possible for Britain to protect their strategic interest meant that brings us to the last aspect of the reasons why the British built the Ugandan Railway. Now, over the course of this railway, there was the problems that the process of building this railway. How did it start? So the survey was done by Captain MacDonald of the Royal Engineers Company, and the engineer who was in charge of this construction was somebody called George Whitehouse. Now, the headquarters of the work or the construction was based in Kilindini Harbour, that is in Mombasa, and the work on the railway commenced on the 5th August of 1896. Now, from Mombasa, the railway was built inwards, westwards, through Mariakani, Voi, then Savo. And by 1899, it had reached Nairobi. And by thus reaching Nairobi, the railway track had covered 326 miles. Nairobi was the midway point between Mombasa and Kisumu. And the headquarters of the construction was then moved to Nairobi. And what is Nairobi by then? Nairobi was derived from a Maasai word, meaning a place of cool waters. So from this region, this place, the railway constructors and the workers, they could replenish their goods. So it was also centrally located, both linking Port Florence and Mombasa. Then by December, the 1st of December in 1901, the railway had reached Kisumu. So the construction of the work was done by Indian coolies, and we shall see the reason why the Indians were preferred instead of the African workers. Now, it took 6 years to construct the railway at a cost of £8 million. So if you convert that currency by then and convert it to date, then it means that it was a lot of billions of shillings that was used to construct this railway. The Indians were called in. Why? Because initially the British had first colonized Indians, meaning they had the experience of building railways that they have taken from the British as they had observed from the British as they were building the railway in their country. Again, they had this experience in rail building at home. Since the British, India was a British colony. Again, the natives, the African natives, they were unwilling to offer this labor. Again, majority of the natives or the Africans within Kenya, they were unskilled and they were of no use when it came to matters engineering. After all, maybe they could be very skilled in things like hunting and farming, but not things to do with engineering. So let us talk about the challenges that faced the construction workers during their construction of the railway. We'll also tackle the challenges that the British faced, and we'll talk about them in this way. Now, the first one was scarcity of suppliers. Now, the railway, the scarcity of suppliers. The railway used to cross a vast majority of dry land. Now, if you have navigated East African territory or you've navigated Kenya, our country, then you'll realize that most of the land in Kenya, the vast majority of the land is even very, very dry. So this dry wasteland meant that it was very, very hard for the white men and for the Indian coolies and all the workers there to obtain the essential materials that they needed. Now, the very, very essential material that they needed starts from the basic one, that is food and water. So these were very, very hard for them to obtain. Then the last thing was that they could not even obtain medicine. And that brings us to our second point, that is the delays. And why were the delays? Now, the delivery of buildings materials had to come from Mombasa. So they used to experience a lot of delays. Why? These goods again had to be transported via this railway that was being constructed. Now, it is this that brought about the second challenge. The third challenge is the cost. Now, the importation of Indian coolies or to solve this labor problem also increased the cost. Why? These guys had to be paid. So this process delayed even the construction. Then again, labor. The Africans were not willing to provide labor to the manual labor that was needed during this construction. So these Africans, they were also not skilled in construction works. So this problem was solved by the importation of the Indian coolies. Then the next one is weather. The weather of East Africa can be very challenging. Why? Heavy rains at first delayed the onset construction of the railway from Kilindini coming westwards. Then after these heavy rains, the drought in the Nyika region, especially the region between Nairobi to Mombasa, that is the Nyika, that falls largely under the Nyika Plateau, the drought in this region also made the work to be very, very difficult. Why? The workers lacked basic needs like water that they needed to drink. Now, this situation was controlled by carrying water, ferrying water by the train each day for the workers. Then the third one is tropical diseases. Now, Kenya, the equator line passes through the Kenya as a latitude. Now, Kenya is between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and the equator passes in between, meaning our area or our country is prone to diseases like tropical diseases. Now, tropical diseases are diseases that affect the areas between the Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn region, in between, along the equator. Now, those diseases are very, very dangerous for the people who are not used or who have not built the immune system that can enable them to survive this region. So diseases like malaria, diseases like sleeping sickness, and the last one is diarrhea, that are very, very common in this region. They affected the workers and it rendered many of them to be ineffective during the work. Then jiggers. The Indian attack workers, they were very, very soft. So they were affected by the jiggers that infected their limbs. It have infected their limbs so much that at times they could not even go to work. Then attack by lions. When in between the towns of Voi and the town of Titandei, in between is the National Park of Voi. Now, when the workers reached the railway workers reached Savo Forest, then they were attacked by the man-eating lions. There's a whole documentary that has been done on how a lot of these Indian workers were killed and how soldiers had to be imported from Britain just to come and solve this menace. So these man-eating lions used to attack these people at Savo, and it nearly, in fact, stopped the construction of the work. The lions were hunted and killed down by one Colonel Patterson, who was imported just from Britain to come and deal with that menace. To date, these lions, their remains have been restored to the museums in America. You can go and watch some of the remains there. Then the African resistance. So the Nandi resistance, which was the longest resistance that the British ever faced, was a factor that also affected the railway. So when the railway crossed the land of the Nandi, because earlier on they had a leader who was called Orekoyot, he had prophesied about a big snake that was going to cross through Nandi land, and this snake was going to breathe fire. Snake was the railway line, and what was going to breathe fire is the train that was going to, or locomotive that was going to be used in this rail. Then this snake, it was going to quench his thirst in Lake Victoria. Now to them, this snake was this railway line, and it was to be resisted at all cost. Now all this resistance and how long it was, it almost affected the railway lane. At one time, the British were contemplating about diverting the railway such that it passes southern and it should not pass the Nandi land, but finally they passed through Lake Victoria. Then the landscape. Again, the East Africa is blessed, and Kenya specifically is blessed with escarpments and very, very nice geographical features. Now, to the construction workers or engineers, this provides a nightmare or a challenge. Now, these enormous escarpments post engineering challenges that cause the railways builders problems. Why? It was difficult to construct railway in this landscape, and the problem was overcome by building materials by rope in wagon. So the constructors had to go through wide river valleys. Again, these were also challenges that they faced. Now, afterwards, let us go to we've studied the problems that that were encountered during the construction of the railway. Now, let us go to the effects of the construction of the Uganda Railway. Now, the first effect is it brought about Asian settlement. Now, the Asians or the Indian coolies, after completing their work on the Uganda Railway, they preferred not to go back to their country, that was India primarily. They set up shops called, they were known as dukawalas. So this acronym of duka is a short form of these dukawalas. These are the business shops that these Indians set up they completed the construction of the railway line. Now, these Indians that are involved in this line and they decided to engage themselves in commercial activities. So they used to set shops at various points along the railway lines. Now, if you go to most towns along the railway lines today, the Ugandan Railway, you'll find that most of them are dominated by Indians. So towns such as Mombasa, Kisumu, Nairobi, and Nakuru, major towns along the railway line, and Eldoret, you'll find that there are a lot of Asian populations that have settled there. Now, these Asian population or the Indian population, they're descendants of formerly the coolies or the former railway construction workers that the British introduced. Now, it is these Indians who developed the early trade of the British East Africa. So it is them that also introduced the first currency, or the rupee. Now, the rupee was a type of coin that had a hole in the middle. So you can go to the Kenya archives or the museum, and you'll find a sample of this rupee coin that was later adopted by the colonial government as a medium of exchange. You'll find that when the Mau Mau started emerging in Kenya, that why were they agitated during the fight for the independence is that they were paid in rupees while their European counterparts were paid in pounds. So this currency was very, very common with the Indians, but it was not common with the white men, meaning that they were disenfranchised after the World War. So they became rebels. But that is not what I wanted to say. I wanted to say that it is the Asians who even introduced this currency of the rupees because they settled in Kenya. Then urbanization. Now, the growth of major Kenyan towns are along the railway lane. In fact, the economic viability of Kenya still is dependent on the areas or the economic blueprint of the East African Railway or the Ugandan Railway. Why? Because most towns, almost all the four cities that are there in Kenya, starting with Nairobi, Mombasa, Kisumu, and Nakuru, all of them are along the railway lane. Now, other major towns such as Voi, others such as Eldoret, they were also found along the railway lane. Now, these centers, particularly Nairobi, became important, and even it made the colonialists to even make it to become a headquarter. Why? These towns also became ports, especially the Port Florence in Kisumu, that was the inland port, and the Mombasa port, which was the coastal port. Now, these were very, very important ports for East Africa. Then it also led to settler farming. Yes? I'll introduce in the next topic how settlers came and their reasons for coming in Kenya. But this settler farming was prompted by the development of the railway line. Why? Because after the development of the infrastructure, then important cash crops such as coffee, tea, sisal, and pyrethrum were introduced. And this settlement of the Europeans in this interior is what led to the introduction of such crops. Now, these crops also included tobacco. It is the settlers who used to farm them. Now, after the railway line had been developed, then it became very easy for them to come and start settling in because there was availability of good transport network. Then the next one is the creation of employment. Now, Africans used to be employed in the European farms that were along the railway line. Now, during the construction of the railway, however, several Africans were employed as semi-skilled workers. Semi-skilled workers, these are just people who used to offer manual labor within the construction time. Upon completion of this railway, again, many more were employed to do various semi-skilled and later skilled jobs. So later, on the eve of independence, most of the Africans were even trained to be the captains behind driving these locomotives or the trains that were left by the colonialists. Now, if it were not for the railway line, then some of these Africans could not have gotten their jobs in the East African Railway Corporation. Then the next one is that it led to the opening of the interior. Yes? Now, opening of the interior is this way. Now, it made after the railway line had been constructed, the work of the government and the colonial government control of the interior was much quicker and more effective. Why? If there was any form of resistance in the interior, then the British could just bring reinforcement direct from the Britain, then land them at the port of Mombasa and transport them to the interior very easily. Then it led to the transfer of capital to Nairobi. Initially, Machakos was destined for greatness. So the only blunder that made Machakos not to become the capital city of Kenya was a survey mistake that never linked the railway line to Machakos. But later, it also became a blessing in disguise for Nairobi, because when the railway line or the railway line workers reached Nairobi, they found that the place was replenishing because of the cool waters. So again, Nairobi was centrally located. It was almost central to Kisumu, and again it was also central to Mombasa. Then when the establishment of Nairobi was complete as a major replenishing point, it meant that the next thing was that the colonial government transferred the headquarters from Mombasa to Nairobi. Again, Mombasa was also made way between Mombasa and the lake. Now this was very, very important. So the railway came as a blessing for Nairobi. Then it was also a source of revenue. How? It was a source of revenue because the colonial government could derive a lot of taxes or income generating from the income generating activities that were along the railway line. The interaction of communities. That is the last one in my slide, but there are others that I will have to tell you again, and I'll explain them there. The interaction of communities. There were prior to the railway construction, most communities of East Africa in the British Protectorate, that is Kenya, they are not interacted. For instance, the Kikuyu maybe had not known that the Luos existed by then. The Mijikendas had not known that the Kalenjins existed by that time, and all these communities. Now, when the railway passed through this vast domain of East Africa, then it meant that various communities started interacting. How? As they were recruited as the labor force in the East African Railway Corporation development, then they had to interact with one another, and this is the first thing that ensured that these communities interacted. Now, others that are not there in the slide include growth of trade. Now, because of the railway line, trade developed not only in the coast that was majorly a predominant trading center that was there even before the colonialist came or before the 19th century. Other regions in the interior were now connected to the outside world. For instance, for an advantage, the interior was now linked to the port. Now, it meant that it led to the expansion of the import and export and trade activity. Instead of trading things like ivory, leopard skin, and ostrich, now we were going to trade things like agricultural products, serious ones like dairy products, coffee products, and tea products. Now, this is the trade that was developed because of our railway line. Then again, it led to the growth of industries. So the railway led to the establishment of agricultural-based industries in Kenya, and they include the milk processing industries, the flour and the milling industries. Now, it also led to the spread of Christianity. Why? Because it facilitated the movement and transport for the missionaries. The quick and reliable transport also meant that the missionaries were encouraged to travel to the interior and continue spreading the Christianity. And the presence of this Christian missionary also led to far-reaching consequences for the Africans, both economically and socially. So in the next lessons, I'll also tell you how missionaries were able to develop hospitals, schools, and they also led to the further education and enlightenment of the native Africans within the British East African Protectorate. It led to the development of transport and communication. Now, the railway line also, the establishment of this railway line also went with the construction of other means of transport. So, for instance, the Mombasa-Nairobi highway, if you travel alongside it, you'll realize that it travels parallel, just the way the Uganda Railway travels. So it meant that other parts, other infrastructure such as roads, number 2, telegraphs, number 3, postal services and air transport, they were all opened to the interior where initially they were never there before. So this opened Kenya to the whole outside world. Then it encouraged the immigration of European settlers to Kenya. So after the construction of this railway, the colonial government encouraged their settlers to come to Kenya, and these settlers, they were also invited to establish modern farms to make this railway to be viable, to make this region also to be economical. Again, their presence was also going to make the maintenance of the railway to be very, very easy. Why? Because the taxes and revenue that they generated could be used to sustain the railway. Then the last thing is that it led to the change of political boundaries. Now, initially, places like Kisumu, Naivasha, and onwards, Nakuru, that used to be part of Uganda. Now, after the completion of the railway, and when the railway reached Kisumu in 1902, the administrative boundary of the British colony changed. Now, all regions on the east of Lake Victoria, up to the present day Naivasha, they were all transferred from Uganda to East African Protectorate, that is Kenya. And that is why we have that part to be part of Kenya today. Now, we can conclude that this railway proved to be a lifeline of the colonial economy. Why? It did not only provide transport for these immigrant settlers, but it also provided the government with a steady source of revenue. It also made social interaction to be very, very easy. It also made the interaction of economic interaction among Africans to be very, very possible, and it also enhanced trade. Now, this eventuality is what saw the growth of African nationalism. Why? After the African communities interacted with one another, then they started fighting for one accord to get the colonialists out of the country. Now, without the railway, this could have been impossible. Again, it had a negative consequence. Why? The colonialists never bought this land along this land that was the railway was constructed, meaning or implying that this crown land that was used to build the railway line, it was forcefully obtained from the African without reimbursement or without pay. It is this that meant that Africans, they lost their land along the railway line, and consequently Kenya was declared to be a crown land. Now, in our next lesson, we'll study about settler farming in Kenya, and that you'll realize that one consequence that I explained is that it led to settler farming in Kenya. The introduction of the building of or the construction of the Ugandan Railway led to the establishment of settler farming. Now, these settlers, who are they and what did they do? Now, it is this building of this Ugandan Railway that marked the new phase of Kenya's economic development. Now, in the highland regions in the early 20th century, a British known as Charles Eliot, who was the British commissioner between 1900 to 1904, he encouraged the Europeans to come and settle in Kenya, especially in the highlands. And why? Because this highland, they were almost replicating the same climate as the one in Britain. Now, as the British government representative in Kenya, Eliot felt that large-scale farming could help the protectorate to meet the cost of administration and to maintain the railway. Now, it is because of this objective that the settlers arrived, and it is because of this objective that these settlers developed early agriculture in the early 20th century in Kenya as a colony. Now, this was not an easy task, as we are going to realize in the next lesson. We are going to realize how it was very, very hard for these settlers to find even African labor. But all of this settler farming and all the things that I've said that I'm going to teach in the next class were consequently brought by the railway construction, that is the Uganda Railway. So, class, I want you to remember the effects of Uganda Railway, the construction of Uganda Railway. I want you to remember the problems that the colonialists or the British encountered during the construction of the railway. I want you to remember majorly the reasons why this railway was built. Why? Because all of this comprise a very, very good part of paper 1, especially section B of KCSE papers. So with those and many other remarks, thank you and have a nice time.